The island of Okinawa, May 21st, 1945. American Marines push forward through smoke and shattered villages, thinking the battle is finally turning in their favor. But beneath their boots lies a hidden world, a maze of tunnels stretching for miles under the island. A world the Japanese believed would protect them. When the first Marines crawled inside, they expected ambushes, booby traps, and machine gun nests. Instead, the air was thick, heavy, choking with something far worse than gunpowder. The silence was unnatural, and then they saw thousands of bodies, soldiers and civilians alike, packed into the stone corridors. Their final refuge turned into a tomb. Over 5,000 souls had entered these tunnels. Almost none ever came out. What the Americans found beneath Okinawa wasn't just death. It was the truth about a war fought without mercy, and a glimpse of the nightmare that an invasion of mainland Japan would unleash. To understand how these tunnels became one of the darkest chapters of World War II, you have to go back to the desperate final days of the Pacific War. The discovery in that dark Okinawan tunnel was not an accident. It was the product of a battle unlike any the world had ever seen. To understand why thousands of bodies lay hidden underground, we must return to the beginning, to the island itself. Okinawa was more than land. It was the last barrier between the Allies and Japan's home islands. Whoever controlled it controlled the path to Tokyo. The Japanese called it the shield of the homeland. The Americans called it the stepping stone to invasion. But history would name it something else entirely: the graveyard of the Pacific. In April 1945, the Allied fleet appeared on the horizon. Over 1,000 ships, the largest armada of the Pacific War, carried 500,000 men toward a single strip of land. Waiting for them were more than 180,000 Japanese troops and thousands of civilians, many forced into service. The stage was set for the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. But Japan's commanders knew they could not defeat America in the open. Instead, they turned Okinawa itself into a weapon. The island was honeycombed with caves and tunnels carved deep into hillsides and cliffs. Some stretched for miles, some held entire hospitals, others became fortresses packed with ammunition, supplies, and terrified civilians driven underground by fear of invasion. For American soldiers, this was a new kind of battlefield. There were no clear front lines. The enemy was invisible, hidden behind rock, waiting in silence. One Marine later recalled, "You never fought the man in front of you. You fought the darkness itself." And that darkness would soon reveal horrors no soldier had ever imagined. Because the deeper the Allies advanced, the more they realized these tunnels were not just defenses. They were traps. They were prisons. And, as they would soon discover, many had already become graves. The first encounters with Okinawa's tunnels left American soldiers stunned. They had trained for firefights in jungles and beaches, but not for war inside the earth itself. Every entrance looked the same: a jagged hole in the hillside, black as night, reeking of damp stone and smoke. To the men peering inside, it felt like stepping into another world. At first, they expected soldiers to be ambushed. Grenades were tossed into the darkness, rifles raised, flamethrowers primed. The blasts echoed like thunder through the caves. But when the Marines advanced, they sometimes found not enemy combatants but civilians. Families crouched in corners, clutching children, their faces pale in the flashlight beam. A corporal later wrote, "We were ready for gunfire. Instead, we found crying." I cannot forget the sound. This was the first shock. The tunnels blurred the line between soldier and civilian. Every shadow could hide an ambush or a terrified family. American troops could not tell the difference until it was too late. The second shock came with the scale of the underground network. Maps captured after the battle revealed hundreds of interconnected tunnels. Entire villages moved beneath the earth. Some chambers were used as hospitals, where surgeons worked by candlelight amid groans of the wounded. Others stored ammunition, hidden only meters from terrified civilians. For the Marines, each tunnel demanded a choice: advance slowly and risk ambush, or seal it shut with explosives, burying everything soldiers and families alike inside. One lieutenant admitted bitterly, "We called it clearing caves, but in truth we were burying lives." These choices wore heavily on the men. Victory in Okinawa was supposed to be about capturing ground, but in the tunnels, it became about confronting the unbearable. Every entrance carried the possibility of survival or tragedy, and no soldier could know which until he stepped inside. And with each step, the darkness grew heavier. Because the further they pushed into Okinawa's tunnels, the more they realized that these were not simply fortifications of war. They were places where humanity itself was breaking apart. The deeper the Americans advanced into Okinawa, the more dangerous the tunnels became. Japanese defenders turned every cave into a fortress. Hidden machine guns fired from the dark. Snipers waited behind the stone. Mortars were wheeled to the mouth of caves, fired, and pulled back before the enemy could respond. The US Marines knew they could not win with rifles alone. They needed a new method, and it became one of the most brutal tactics of the Pacific War. They called it the blowtorch and corkscrew. Flamethrowers and demolition charges replaced careful advances. Marines would fire streams of burning fuel into the cave mouth. The roar was deafening. Flames raced through the tunnels, clinging to walls, filling every corner with fire and smoke. Then came explosives. Satchel charges and grenades rolled inside, collapsing ceilings, sealing entrances, and burying everyone within. The results were horrifying. Survivors stumbled out, their bodies scorched and broken. Many never emerged at all. Entire groups of soldiers and civilians alike were entombed beneath the earth. One Marine wrote simply, "The screams lasted minutes. The silence lasted forever. The tactics were effective. By May, hundreds of caves had been neutralized. But effectiveness came at a terrible cost. Soldiers realized they were not just fighting an enemy. They were destroying entire underground worlds, hospitals, families, communities trapped by command. Psychological strains spread through the ranks. Some Marines admitted they could not forget the faces of civilians who had been caught in the fire. Others hardened themselves, convincing their minds that every cave was only military. Yet, deep down, they all knew the truth. Each sealed tunnel was more than a military target. It was a mass grave. And as the campaign pressed on, the scale of these graves grew larger. With every hill taken, with every cave destroyed, the Americans uncovered a darker truth. Okinawa's tunnels were not just battlefields. They were becoming monuments to human loss. By late May, the Americans had fought across Okinawa for nearly 2 months. Every hill seemed to hide another tunnel. Every tunnel held another fight. But what they found near the southern ridges was unlike anything they had seen before. Private William Harris was among the first to enter. His unit expected another ambush, machine guns, grenades, perhaps even suicide attackers. Instead, when their flashlights cut through the darkness, the beams fell on stillness. Helmets, boots, faces, bodies, not a dozen, not 100, but thousands. The men stood frozen. The smell struck first, heavy, suffocating, impossible to ignore. Then came the silence. No cries. No movement. Just row after row of lifeless forms stretching deep into the cavern. Civilians and soldiers lay together, tangled where they had fallen. Mothers held infants in their arms. Young boys wore the armbands of conscripts. Entire families lay pressed against stone walls, now cold and still. The count would later reach 5,000. But for Harris and his comrades, numbers had no meaning in that moment. All they could feel was shock. One Marine whispered, "We came here to fight men with guns. Instead, we walked into a graveyard." Reports suggested starvation, suffocation, even mass suicides had claimed those inside. Japanese propaganda had told civilians that surrender meant torture and death. Many chose instead to remain underground, sealed away with soldiers, waiting for an end that never came. For the Americans, the discovery was overwhelming. Victory on the battlefield now felt hollow. They had not captured an enemy position. They had uncovered a tragedy. And this was not the only tunnel. Across Okinawa, more caverns would reveal the same haunting truth. Each discovery raised the same question in the minds of the men who found them. If this is the price of one island, what would happen when the fight reached Japan itself? The discovery of thousands of bodies inside Okinawa's tunnels was not just a military shock, it was a human catastrophe that revealed the full weight of the Pacific War. For Japanese civilians, the tunnels had been promised as safety. Propaganda told them that underground shelters would protect families until victory came, but in truth, they became prisons. Food ran out. Air grew thin. Disease spread quickly. Many civilians, terrified of the Americans, chose death over surrender. Entire families took their lives in the dark, convinced it was the only escape. One survivor later recalled, "We were told the Americans would torture us, so mothers gave poison to their children. Fathers carried grenades. Families died together in silence." The tragedy shook American soldiers as well. They had expected to fight an army. Instead, they stepped into caverns filled with civilians who had never raised a weapon. A Marine wrote home, "I thought war was about shooting at men who shoot back. But in these caves, there were no shots. Only crying, and then nothing." The weight of these discoveries spread quickly through the ranks. Soldiers began to question what victory meant. Clearing a tunnel no longer felt like defeating an enemy. It felt like uncovering a secret burial ground. Many admitted that the sight of dead children haunted them more than any battle. For the Japanese defenders, the tunnels became symbols of betrayal. Their commanders had ordered civilians underground, knowing there was no escape. The illusion of honor collapsed in the darkness, replaced by despair. Soldiers who surrendered spoke of shame, not just for defeat, but for the suffering forced upon their own people. The human cost of Okinawa could not be measured only in numbers. It was seen in the faces of survivors stumbling from the caves, in the silence of villages that no longer existed, in the memories carried home by every soldier who walked those tunnels. And yet, the Americans realized this was only one island. If Okinawa could consume over 200,000 lives, what would happen if the war reached Japan's home islands themselves? By June 1945, the Battle of Okinawa reached its breaking point. The island that once seemed small now felt endless, a place where every ridge and every tunnel consumed more lives. For the Americans, victory was near. For the Japanese, survival was impossible. And for the civilians, there was no escape at all. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Over 12,000 Americans lay dead. More than 70,000 were wounded. Japanese losses were even greater. 100,000 soldiers killed, many fighting to the last breath inside the tunnels. But the greatest tragedy was among the civilians. Estimates rose beyond 100,000, many lost in caves that had become mass graves. In total, nearly a quarter of Okinawa's population vanished in less than 3 months. This was the scale climax of the Pacific War. No other battle matched the intensity of Okinawa, not Iwo Jima, not Guadalcanal. Every statistic told the same story, that this was the costliest fight in the history of the Pacific theater. But beyond the numbers came a revelation that shook soldiers on both sides. American troops entered tunnels expecting warriors and instead found families. They saw children in uniforms too large for their bodies. They uncovered evidence that civilians had been told lies, that surrender meant torture, that capture meant humiliation. For many, those lies led entire families to die by their own hands. This was the moral climax. War was no longer about territory or strategy. It had become a war against truth itself. One Marine admitted, "We thought we were liberating an island. Instead, we uncovered the cost of a nation's deception." The Battle of Okinawa ended in June, but its impact spread far beyond the island. For American commanders, the tunnels and their hidden dead became a warning. If this was what Japan's civilians would endure on Okinawa, what would they do on the home islands? That question would help shape one of the most controversial decisions in human history, the use of the atomic bomb. And so, in the silence of Okinawa's tunnels, the future of the entire war was decided. The guns fell silent on Okinawa in late June 1945. The hills that had once thundered with artillery now lay quiet, scarred by craters and smoke. The tunnels that had echoed with fire and screams were sealed, leaving behind only shadows and silence. For the men who walked those caves, the memories never faded. Private William Harris, the young soldier who had first lowered his flashlight into the cavern of 5,000 bodies, later admitted that he did not remember the sound of victory. He remembered the silence of the dead. That silence followed him long after the war ended. The Battle of Okinawa left the Allies with control of the island, but at a cost that shook even hardened commanders. Over 200,000 lives had been lost in less than 3 months. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, and its lessons were impossible to ignore. For American leaders, Okinawa became a grim warning. If Japan's civilians had been willing to die in tunnels, on cliffs, and in caves, what would they do when the war reached their home islands? That question weighed heavily on the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In many ways, the shadows of Okinawa stretched all the way to those cities. For the Japanese survivors, the tunnels remained a symbol of both fear and betrayal. Generations would speak of the lies that drove families underground, of mothers who believed death was safer than surrender, of communities destroyed not only by American fire but by their own leaders' deception. And for the world, Okinawa became a reminder that modern war is not only fought with tanks and planes. It is fought in hearts and minds, in the choices leaders make, and in the stories that survivors carry forward. Today, memorials stand at the mouths of those caves. Visitors walk the same paths where soldiers once fought and civilians once hid. Flowers rest where bodies once lay, and the silence remains a silence not of victory, but of memory. When Harris spoke of Okinawa years later, he did not speak of strategy or tactics, or even the outcome of the war. He spoke of the moment his light revealed the truth. "We thought we were stepping into a bunker," he said, "but in truth, we stepped into a grave." And that is the legacy of Okinawa's tunnels, a warning carved into stone, a truth buried with the dead, and a reminder that the real cost of war is not measured in battles won, but in humanity lost. The silence of Okinawa's tunnels did not remain on the island. It travelled home with every soldier, whispered through every survivor, and eventually reached the halls of power across the world. The war had ended in August 1945 with the atomic bomb, but the memory of Okinawa shaped how nations understood that end. For American veterans, the tunnels became a wound that never healed. Men like Harris returned home carrying images they could not forget: families huddled together in darkness, children lying among rifles, the suffocating stillness of 5,000 bodies. Many struggled to explain what they had seen. Some turned silent, unwilling to revisit those caves even in memory. Others spoke, hoping their words would keep the world from repeating such horrors. In Japan, Okinawa became a national scar. Survivors passed down stories of betrayal, how propaganda convinced civilians that surrender meant torture, how commanders abandoned their people in the name of honor. For decades, these stories were whispered more than spoken, but eventually they emerged in classrooms, books, and memorials. Okinawa became a reminder to future generations that war often consumes its own before it consumes the enemy. Globally, the battle influenced strategy and morality alike. Historians traced the atomic bomb decision back to Okinawa's tunnels, where Americans saw proof that Japan would sacrifice civilians as readily as soldiers. Leaders justified the bomb by pointing to the caves, saying the alternative would be an invasion that might claim millions. Yet the echoes of Okinawa carried another lesson, one not written in military reports. The tunnels revealed the cost of fear, the weight of lies, and the tragedy of a people forced into impossible choices. They showed that modern war is never only about armies. It is about the civilians caught between them, hidden in caves, forgotten in darkness. Today, when visitors walk through preserved tunnels, they hear guides speak not only of battles, but of voices silenced inside. Flowers are laid not only for soldiers, but for families. The earth holds the memory of both, and so the story of Okinawa's tunnels extends far beyond 1945. It reaches into every generation that asks what war demands and what it destroys. Because in the end, the tunnels of Okinawa were not just graves of the past, they were warnings for the future. Decades have passed since the last shots were fired on Okinawa. Yet the voices of that battle have never gone silent. They echo in survivor testimonies, in the trembling words of veterans, and in the solemn prayers offered at memorials carved into the hills where tunnels once ran deep. For survivors, the memory of those caves is sharper than any weapon. Many speak of the darkness that lasted for days, broken only by the sobs of children and the sounds of explosions above. One woman, who was a child in 1945, recalled, "We hid in the cave and believed what we were told, that the Americans would kill us. But when we emerged, they gave us water. I understood then that everything we believed had been a lie." For veterans, the memory carries a different weight. Some could never describe what they saw inside the tunnels. Others tried, but words often failed. A Marine once told his grandson, "I fought men in uniform, but what I remember most are the faces of children in the caves. That is what war left me with." These confessions reveal that the true cost of Okinawa was not measured in territory gained, but in the haunting memories that followed soldiers home. Today, Okinawa has become a place of remembrance. Tourists walk through preserved tunnels, hearing the stories of those who lived and died there. Schoolchildren in Japan study the battle not only as military history, but as a warning of what happens when fear and lies replace truth. Monuments line the cliffs and ridges, each inscribed with names not of armies alone, but of entire families. The island stands as a living reminder that war spares no one. It consumes soldiers and civilians alike. It blurs the line between battlefield and home, between duty and survival. The tunnels of Okinawa remind us that even in the most desperate wars, humanity is what suffers most, and this is the reflection we must carry forward. When we remember Okinawa, we must remember not only the strategy or the statistics, but the people. The families who believed lies. The soldiers who faced choices no one should face. The children whose lives ended before they began. Because history does not end in the past. It waits for us to learn. Or to repeat. So as you leave this story, do not leave it in silence. Share it. Speak of it. Remember that beneath the surface of one small island, over 200,000 lives were lost not just in battle but in darkness. The tunnels of Okinawa are more than graves. They are warnings carved into stone, warnings that tell us, if we forget the human cost of war, we will pay it again.